Hello all. Today I will be sharing my research on suppressing the Black male vote, Ronald Reagan, and the war on drugs. So for the purposes of this research, I'll be focusing solely on the years 1980 through 1988, and I will only present on the domestic drug war. The demographic most affected by the drug policies of former President Ronald Reagan was Black men. Consequently, historians widely agree that the war on drugs was racialized. Incarcerated individuals are denied the right to vote, and in most states, felons cannot vote either. Thereby, Black men incarcerated for drug use are stripped of their role in democracy. Although Black men were not a large part of Reagan's voter base, I argue here that the former president used the war on drugs as a form of voter suppression to ensure that the Black vote did not prove advantageous for his opponent. Here we've got a graph showing the voting results from 1980 broken down into several different groups. In 1980, only 14% of Black Americans voted for Ronald Reagan, and this is from exit poll data from that year. And in 1984, which we can see those numbers up here, only 9% of Black Americans voted for Reagan. Conversely, in 1984, 91% of Black Americans voted for Reagan's opponent, Walter Mondale. We can conclude from this evidence that Reagan, especially after 1980, was aware that the Black community was likely to support his opponent and consequently sought to suppress a demographic of voters that could possibly threaten his chances at the polls and later the goals of his administration. In a speech from July of 1986, Reagan claimed that, quote, "Our object is not to punish users, but to help them, and not to throw them in jail, but to free them from dependency, not to ruin their lives by putting them behind bars, but to prevent their lives from being ruined by drugs." This statement is in direct contradiction to Reagan's actions regarding the issue. By 1986, it was clear that Reagan was directing more federal funding to law enforcement than he was to rehabilitation or education programs and facilities. In what appears to be a series of mixed messages, in a later 1986 interview, Reagan offers the following regarding penalties for drug dealers. "I would tell you that my own personal view is that if you're talking about the death penalty, I know they deserve it. But no, I would think that we might be taking on then something that would divide our ranks because there are so many people who don't believe in the death penalty for anything." Earlier in the same interview, however, Reagan had said otherwise, noting that instead of sending drug users to jail, quote, "I think we should offer help for them." The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, particularly Subtitle 5, Death Penalty for Certain Offenses, reflected Reagan's sentiments from his earlier interview. The act amended the Controlled Substances Act to establish procedures for the imposition of the death penalty for certain continuing criminal enterprise drug offenses. This act was introduced on September 8, 1986, exactly 5 weeks after Reagan said that while he thinks the death penalty is deserved, it is not something he would implement. The amendment became law on October 27, 1986, as illustrative of a disconnect between Reagan's public interviews and speeches and his actions. The act also, quote, amends penalty provisions of the Controlled Substances Act to impose a mandatory term of life imprisonment without release with respect to violators convicted of a third felony drug offense. Drug crimes occur more often in impoverished communities, which are also often communities of color, and therefore Black individuals were once again disproportionately faced with severe penalties as opposed to receiving the types of assistance Reagan had formerly claimed to support. Additionally, the act, quote, amends the Controlled Substances Act to apply mandatory minimum sentencing provisions to offenses involving the distribution of 5 grams or less of marijuana to persons under age 21, end quote. More likely to be stopped and frisked than their white counterparts, Black men were thus more likely to be caught with a personal amount of a controlled substance than white people who also had small amounts of an illegal substance. In the years 1981 to 1988, the federal government spent more than $13 billion on the anti-drug effort. A Congressional Research Service, CRS report titled Federal Drug Control, President's Budget Request for Fiscal Year 1988 includes reports made before Congress wherein the Director of Office of Management and Budget, James C. Miller III, quote, recently testified that since fiscal year 1981, resources devoted to all federal anti-drug efforts have grown by 220% in nominal dollars. He pointed out that in terms of outlays as opposed to budget authority, the fiscal year 1988 request proposes a total increase of approximately $500 million, end quote, $3.5 billion as opposed to $3 billion in fiscal year 1987. Reagan continually justified these constant increases in spending on the anti-drug effort by overemphasizing that drugs were a threat to society. In fact, when the 1988 budget request was made, people accused the administration of slashing budgets against drugs, so much so that the Reagan administration felt compelled to repeatedly state that they were in fact continuing to spend more on the effort. Miller later states that to suggest that the president has abandoned his commitment to combating drug abuse is an assertion that simply ignores the facts. Anti-drug funds were allocated to several different categories of spending: drug law enforcement, drug demand reduction, drug abuse prevention, and drug abuse treatment. In the 8 years of Reagan's presidency, law enforcement received almost 7 times as much funding as treatment did. You can see in this graph up here, the budget request for fiscal year 1988. These numbers are in millions of dollars. Miller asserts that, quote, the federal government has a clear responsibility to help state and local governments combat drug trafficking and drug-related crime. The administration felt that it was their role to provide funding for these expenditures. Miller also states that, quote, the drug programs contained in fiscal year 1988 budget clearly fall into this category of essential government functions, end quote. The war on drugs was justified as an essential government function, and the federal government claimed responsibility for helping state and local governments combat the drug issue. The administration was willing to justify any amount of spending that would appear to be combating the drug issue, when in fact, more money was being spent on law enforcement with the end goal to incarcerate than was being poured into treatment for people struggling with addiction. Additionally, in the report, it was noted that, quote, in the area of treatment and prevention, the GAO report noted above found that from 1981 through 1985, federal spending for these programs declined 16%, an effective reduction of nearly 40% when inflation is taken into account. Treatment programs were in fact losing funding in the later years of Reagan's presidency. The decline in funding could be because some of the budget allocations for this area were understood to be one-time funds given to boost organizations. However, the continual increase in spending in other areas shows a stark contrast to this. By the end of his administration, more than $3 billion was being spent to combat the drug issue annually, and the majority of these funds were being poured into the law enforcement aspect. It can be inferred from the rhetoric Reagan used about drugs, the demographics of Reagan's voters, the legislation passed during Reagan's administration, and the ways in which money for the war on drugs was allocated, that Reagan was aware of the implications that a war on drugs would have on those targeted by it. Historians and scholars have already proven that the war on drugs was racially motivated and that Black American men were the primary targets of the drug war. Reagan undoubtedly knew the implications of what being incarcerated meant for individuals. He knew that those currently incarcerated were stripped of their right to vote. He knew that it was harder to find a job with a criminal record. And he knew that in most states, felons could not vote even after they served their time. The combination of these various sources of information indicates that Reagan knew and understood that the war on drugs could be a powerful tool of voter suppression. Reagan had almost no support from the Black community, as is made evident by the demographics of his voter base in both the 1980 and 1984 elections. To solidify more support, Reagan was able to use harmful rhetoric to gain support for his anti-drug policies and massive amounts of anti-drug spending. By then targeting communities of color and specifically Black men, Reagan was able to ensure that these individuals would not be able to vote and therefore not be able to vote against him. Reagan used the war on drugs to put citizens who opposed him politically behind bars. The implications that incarceration has on the ability for one to do one's civic duty are dire, and Reagan used that to his advantage. Thank you all for watching my research. I very much enjoyed working on this topic. I hope you enjoyed.